Hello and
Okay.
welcome back to Well That Aged Well. This week I'm joined by Tamim and Ansary, who has written The Great Games Without Rules, the often interrupted history of Afghanistan, which I'm of course holding up right here. And this week we are going to do a two-parter. That part one is this week. We're going to take a look at the first part of Afghan history, and in the next week we're going to take a look at Afghanistan from the 1900s until today. And I think this is one of those important episodes as well, when in order to understand how Afghanistan is what we know it as today. And before we begin on the history itself, I want to ask about, and you discussed this in the book as well in the opening, I believe, if about Afghanistan being called the graveyard of empire. So let's discuss the term and what your thoughts on Afghanistan being called the graveyard of empire.
Uh, I think it's a Western term, and it emerged during the time when the British were trying to take over Afghanistan, and it happened to be a time when the Russians also were expanding, so they were trying to extend an imperial overlordship on Afghanistan, and these foreign imperial powers were not able to do much in Afghanistan. So I think let's step away from graveyard of empires because people inspired by the graveyard of empires phrase sometimes say something like, even Alexander couldn't conquer Afghanistan. Actually, Alexander did,
Mhm.
you know, and you know what? It took him 2 years. For Alexander, that was a long time. But I was hearing people say that when we were in the 19th or 20th year of America trying to establish an imperial power over there. Uh, so I think that the graveyard of empires leads you a little bit in the wrong direction. But the reason that Afghanistan has been so problematic for imperial powers from far away is that it's a peculiarly uh, mountainous place. Uh, it's um, uh, it's the intractable sort of mountainous barrier between two major civilization areas. Actually, three civilization areas, if you want to look at it. There's the Iranian highlands over there. There's the Indian subcontinent to the south and east, and there's the Central Asian Turco-Mongolian steppes up north. So from all of these directions, there's cultural power pressing in, and none of them was able to, put their border on the other side of those mountains. And they were never able to completely control the mountains and just make the border be the other side because everyone who came through Afghanistan ended up leaving remnants of themselves settled into those cracks and canyons that was the geography of Afghanistan. So that in Afghanistan, what you found was, there were Turks there, there was uh, Hindi speaking people there was Iranian speaking people there were Buddhists went through, there was, Zoroastrians went through, there was a little bit of everything. The Greek Alexander left behind Greek culture in Afghanistan, and then the Muslims came, the Arabs came, so everybody's been through there, and the people who conquered Afghanistan, and some did, it's like Genghis Khan, the Mongolian nomadic warlord. Yeah, he conquered Afghanistan. He destroyed whole cities in Afghanistan, and supposedly remnants of his armies stayed behind there. They settled in. So central Afghanistan is the homeland of the Hazaras. Hazaras comes from, we're told, the word Hazar, which meant thousand. And the Mongolian armies, they were organized into groups of 1,000 in the same way that the Roman armies were organized into groups of 100. So in Rome, we have centurions as the name of a soldier. Here, the Hazaras were, soldiers from these 1,000-person groupings that the Mongols left behind. And then there's the Pashtuns and so on. So there's some kind of a culture that has steeped and formed in Afghanistan over millennia that is prototypically a mixture of different things.
Hmm. So let's begin, of course, very begin, and you open your book, if I may quote, around the same time that George Washington was coming of age in North America. A tribal warrior named Ahmad Khan was troubling to gather an empire in Central South Asia. So let's talk a little bit about Ahmad Khan and his rise to power.
Uh, okay, well, Ahmad Shah Baba, King Ahmad the father is what that translates to. Ahmad Shah Baba was a Pashtun, and when he emerged as a young man, he became an aide de camp to the Iranian warrior Nader Shah Afshar, who had put together a far-flung but brief empire, and he had, conquered his way into India. And then one day he died, or he was assassinated in his camp. This Nader Shah Afshar, this Iranian guy, and chaos broke out in the camp. And it is said that Ahmad Shah A, protected that guy's harem, took a control of them, and B, took a hold of the money that the guy was carrying around in his camp and came back to Afghanistan. And he established his power that way. And then, the Afghan tribes, they knew that with this chaos that had just happened, there was trouble coming from the Western, direction. And they decided that they had to put together some kind of a unified state of some kind right away. They had one of these things that they call Luya Jirga, it means the tribes gather and they talk and they make a decision. And Ahmad Shah Baba was a young guy there, and young guys in these tribal gatherings are supposed to sit quietly and listen to the elders. But there was some religious leader there that said, "What are we talking about? There's the guy, that fellow there, Ahmad Shah. He's the pearl of pearls of the Durrani tribe. He has to be the leader." So they all said, "Okay, yes, Ahmad Shah Baba." And then he took over the role of being the guy that went every which way and conquered everything he possibly could. And he put together an empire that stretched from, roughly where Karachi is now, now it's part of Pakistan, up to the Caspian Sea. So he reconstituted this huge sort of vague empire that had formed in this very area many, many times over history. And he was just the latest one to do that. But in his armies, all of the different people that were in the ethnic groups of that area, they were in that army. So there was a sense in which, you know, uh, serving as soldiers in this guy's army, all of them kind of speaking to one another, some sort of a sense of Afghan tribal nationalism formed. Um, and then, as it happened, that was exactly the same time that the British were starting to take control of India. So there was a time there where there was like the possibility of a contending competition between the British Empire and the Afghan Empire for who was going to control India. As it turned out, the Afghan Empire kind of uh, ran into trouble as soon as Ahmad Shah died, because in that monarchic system, that royal dynastic system, every time a guy died, a fight broke out among all the sons as to who was going to be the next king. And that happened after Ahmad Shah died.
And they had quite a lot
Um,
of sons. He had quite a lot of sons, I believe.
he did. I don't know how many. I know that the fellow who emerged a couple of generations later as the next founder of the Afghan state, his name was Dost Muhammad Khan. Uh, he had 21 sons,
Mm.
you know,
So
and,
they got
and
around.
yeah, 21 sons. And, when you think about the fact that each of them probably had 10 or 20 sons, you can see that the pyramid expands very quickly in the descendants of anybody who's very successful as a military leader. Um, it should be, I'll just mention that in that world, when you hear that, yes, men can have four wives, and so then from four wives they can generate any number of sons, and they can have concubines and so on. Well, yeah, but most people don't. You know, it costs a lot of money to support a big household with many wives. So that's something that you weren't going to find in Afghanistan just among the general population. When I was growing up there, I didn't know anybody who had more than one wife, you know. And so I guess one of my relatives had two wives, and he had one in the village and one in Kabul, but that wasn't common. So it was the warlords that had a lot of sons. And uh, Dost Muhammad, the next big king, uh, the way he organized his empire was he put his sons in charge of all the different areas. So there was a so there everybody in the dynastic family was a copy of the king form that was at the top.
Hmm. It's my understanding, if I remember correctly, that what we think of as Afghanistan today, it wasn't necessarily what we look at the map of Central Asia and see Afghanistan today. It's not necessarily the borders that we see today that were in that, but in those that were considered Afghanistan, if I'm correctly, that it wasn't fixed in a way. It wasn't fixed borders as we see, like I said, today in modern Afghanistan, if I'm correctly.
That's right. Yeah, it didn't have those borders. And I think in the conditions of that time and that area, because it was so feudal, it was sort of like um, it was a form of feudalism. So uh, there were no borders exactly. There were centers of power, and then when you went from one center of power to another one, for a while you were in the area of one lord. And when you got far enough away from his fortress, you weren't really kind of in his area, but you weren't in anybody else's. And then if you kept going, after a while, you were kind of more in the zone of power of a different lord. So the border was actually more of like a vague frontier between two centers of power. And Afghanistan was like that. At that time, you would say that Afghanistan was the general network of power that was anchored by, let's say, five cities. And those five cities are still the main cities. There was Kabul, first of all, there was Herat, Kandahar, Mazar-e Sharif, and then there was always this fifth one that's not part of Afghanistan now, it's Peshawar, which is now in Pakistan. So those five cities kind of defined Afghanistan, not in terms of borders, but in terms of the centers of power.
Hmm. Now, I'm sure we will come back to this when we go into the modern era in the next episode as well. But I want to talk a little about there was a lot of nomadic tribes in Afghanistan as well, a very of importance to the country.
Yeah, that's right. The Kuchis. Kuchi means they move, the moving ones. And I think that they were probably 10 to 15% of the population, even when I mean, I think when my father was born, they were in that numerical zone. And when I was growing up in Kabul in the early 50s, I would go to my door, the door of our yard, open it up, and every week or two, outside in the meadow there'd be a cluster of black tents surrounded by dogs, camels, goats, sheep, uh, and that would be a nomad group was traveling through. And those nomads, uh, they they also sort of didn't recognize a border. They went up to someplace in the north in the summer, and they went down across what is the border of Afghanistan down into Baluchistan, Pakistan in the summer, and then they went back.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Now, of course, it wouldn't be Asian history if it didn't leave the British out, and of course, the British had a presence in Afghanistan to as well. and of course enter Alexander Burns. And let's talk a little bit about how Alexander Burns came to Afghanistan. And he will do quite well in Afghanistan. He will be was quite liked quite well of the royalty, from what I understand.
He traveled to Afghanistan uh, in the early 1800s, and I think he was officially he was on a scouting expedition to look at trade possibilities, and he wrote a book about it. And when he got back to England, that became a bestseller, and it's a lively book. I've actually read that one, and um, and he kind of went native. You know, he went to Afghanistan and he wore Afghan clothes and he did all that thing. Um, and then later on, he was posted there as one of the envoys of the British expedition. So, yeah, he was there before the British controlled the area.
Mm. So let's talk about his relation to the royalty, because he seemed to become quite close to the royal family in Afghanistan.
His relationship to the royal family?
Yeah, because it's from, if I remember correctly, he does seem to be quite close to the royal family as well. They seem to like him.
Well, he stayed with Dost Muhammad in his camp, you know, and when he met the royal family, he met Dost Muhammad, and he had a very sympathetic portrait of him. I don't think I'd say he was necessarily close to the royal family, except that um, uh, you know, any traveler from far away like that would meet whoever was important in the area, and you know, I think it wasn't so much that he was close to the royal family. It's more that he learned the language. He kind of went into Afghanistan and he became an old Afghan hand, so to speak, from that time.
Mm.
Um, I'm not sure what you're getting at with the royal family. Talk a little bit about
No,
that.
I may have been mistaken. It may be that I remember wrongly. Wrongly, it should be just my memory is not remembering correctly. But of course, the next thing I want to talk about is the Russians as well, because you mentioned that they had the Russians in the north and the British in the south. So they were surrounded by both these empires. So let's talk about the Russian presence and their influence. They wanted to have influence in Afghanistan.
They certainly did. Um, you know, I think the British, or actually they were, I guess they were better known as the English then. Now we all call them the British. But uh, the um, the uh, uh, the takeover of Afghanistan by England happened kind of as a result of the king in Afghanistan hosting um, travelers, envoys from the Tsar at the same time as he was entertaining envoys from England. I think Alexander Burns was one of the envoys from England, and then I forget the guy's name, but there was some guy from Russia that came in. And as soon as a Russian guy came in, the British freaked out and said, "You can't have Russians visiting here," because they immediately saw that Russia was going to follow up with more more envoys, and pretty soon it was going to be part of the Russian sphere of interest. Um, and since the king of Afghanistan at that time, let me go back a little bit and review something.
Yeah,
You asked me about Ahmad Shah, and he was like this big king, and he made this big empire. And then, as I said, every time a king like that dies, there's always the possibility and often the probability that he had too many sons, and they're going to start fighting. And that's just what happened with uh, with Ahmad Shah. And so after he died, there was this period of chaos and turmoil when there was like three or four kings, really quick succession. And every time one of the brothers or cousins overthrew the previous guy, oftentimes what he'd do would be to blind the guy so that he couldn't function and come back as a, and take over the throne again. And uh, and uh, the British looked at this and they saw that dynastic rule was the way to go in Afghanistan. That's how that was the line of authority in Afghanistan. And when they decided when the skirmish and battle among cousins finally resulted in a big man emerging from all that, it was this Dost Mohammad that I just talked about, who Burns met and spoke of so sympathetically, and he was by consensus, no cousin or brother was going to stand up to him. He was the king of Afghanistan. And when he invited an envoy from Russia in, England said, "That's it. You're not the king of Afghanistan." They sent in an army. They overthrew him. They did a regime change thing. They removed him from power. They put him in Pakistan someplace. There wasn't Pakistan then, but they put him someplace in British zone, and they paid him a salary and gave him a house. But they said, "You can't be king anymore." And they chose another guy and said, "This guy's the king now." And to the British, the guy they chose had just as much legitimacy as Dost Muhammad. He was related to Ahmad Shah in the same level of kinship. So what's the problem? Here's your king now, the British said. But when they said it, he became not the king. As soon as it was the British deciding who was the legitimate successor to the great Ahmad Shah, uh, the um, the Afghans wouldn't accept that, and what they wouldn't accept was that guy as king. Dost Muhammad had established the kind of authority that enabled him to govern the country, to make decisions that other people said, "Yes, sir, you're right, we'll do that." When the British king was installed, his name was Shah Shuja, nobody would obey his orders. And the country started to fall apart. And when it started to fall apart, the British thought that they could, put it back together with military power. They brought a whole bunch of soldiers in. And then it just fell apart more, and they couldn't control the country. And that's been the pattern of Afghan society all the way to the present day. We'll see what happens in the next decade, but
Come back for the third part in a few years, and we'll see.
yeah, we'll see.
But there is some I found a bit amusing as well, though it must have been terrifying at the time, and that is of course when the Russians entered Afghanistan, and it kind of took both, and of course apparently when the border patrol said you can't come in, but they just kind of blasted in with their army and went into Kabul, and they just found themselves they just pretty much made themselves at home so let's talk a little bit about the Russians entering Afghanistan and how they pretty much made themselves at home. And it must have been terrifying, but it's kind of a little bit I find it a little bit amusing as well, that little story of how the Russians entered Afghanistan.
But I mean, you're talking about 79 because in the
No, not
1840s.
79, but I remember there was a story in earlier on where the Russians kind of I mean, again, I'm sorry if I mixed up a little bit timeline here, but I do. Yeah, never mind. Sorry about this.
Well, the Russians never, back in those days, the Russians never really got in. They brought their army to the border, but they didn't enter Afghanistan because England, aggressively and immediately brought their army in, and they established themselves in Kabul, in the capital. And then there was in 1840 to 42, there was the Afghan English War, and at the end of that war, it was the dramatic event where the entire British community in Kabul decided the game was up, they'd better get out of here. And they tried to leave the country on foot through the Hindu Kush mountains uh, in winter, and all of them died. So that was a very dramatic moment in the history of Afghanistan.
I've apologized if I mixed up the timeline a little bit, but I want to talk about the Afghan-Persian War as well after the first Anglo Afghan War, because they do have a war with Persia as well, I believe, if I remember correctly.
Uh, did you
In
pose a
in
question?
in
Did you pose?
1857, in my notes here, it says when Afghanistan declared a war on Persia. If you can talk a little bit about the Afghan-Persian War.
Afghan-Persian War. I'm not sure.
I apologize for mixing up a little bit. Right?
I don't think Afghan.
I apologize if I'm not right, but no, anyway, sorry about the little mix up in this episode. I want to talk. Of course, I have to talk about the second Afghan war as well, of course, because the British
Okay,
didn't
well,
give let's get back on track. I'm sorry again, but let's get back on track because the British did not give up in conquering Afghanistan. So let's talk, and they tried again with the second Afghan war in again 1878, if I remember correctly. So let's talk about that British returning to Afghanistan.
all right, let's talk about that. But let me just finish up
Yeah,
the end game on the first
yeah,
English-Afghan War, and the climax came because uh, a mob surrounded Alexander Burns's house in Kabul. They had heard that he was messing around with Afghan women, and that was a big serious no-no in Afghan culture. Some stranger coming after your women, uh, and they they actually killed him. And then that was a huge crisis. And Alexander Burns at that time was the second in command, and the boss English guy uh, was he was a different guy, and uh, he tried to negotiate with the leading Afghan Wazir Akbar Khan. They met on a field, and he was killed too. That's when the British panicked, the English panicked, and tried to escape the country through the Hindu Kush Mountains. Uh, so then, after the British died, I mean, after all that army died in the mountains, the the British government brought the guy they had ousted back to Kabul, and they reinstalled him. And they issued a proclamation written in the passive tense that said mistakes have been made, and we're putting this guy back in. So Dost Mohammad, the second founder of Afghanistan, he had two shots at power. He had, originally, then the British ousted him, then the British put him back, and then he was king again. And then there was a period of kind of like Afghanistan was more or less a country, or it was at least a peaceful empire. And um, at the end of it, uh, in the I guess it was the 1860s, he died. His son was installed. And then, that thing happened that happens after a big man dies. His son was installed, and other sons began to fight. And he fought hard, and he got his throne back. But that son was a was an interesting figure who's been forgotten in Afghan history. He was a big modernist, and he created the first newspaper in Afghanistan. He started publishing a newspaper. He brought in a printing press. He set up schools. He revised the tax. He did a lot of stuff, but he made one mistake. He let an envoy from the Russian Tsar come to Kabul. Oh, big no-no. The British said, no, you can't have that. We're gonna get rid of you. They ran their army again, and they came in and they fought, and the exact same thing that happened in the first English war, that exact same thing happened again. In fact, it was such a carbon copy that the leader of the English, legation in Kabul holed up in a vulnerable spot, put his embassy there. A mob surrounded the spot, and he assured the English government that everything was quiet. The next day, he was dead. He'd been killed, and the British brought their armies in. And then they couldn't control the country, and they had a climactic battle in the fields of Maiwan near Kandahar. They were defeated, and in the end, they had to leave. A new king had arisen at that point, and that new king went and met with the British. It was just two guys sitting at a table. It wasn't a treaty between two nations. And that king signed a treaty with the British that said, here is the border, you know? And so that was the moment when Afghanistan had borders. That was, the end of the second British war, British Afghan War. And it was the king of Afghanistan and a guy named Durand, a British diplomat named Durand. And they drew a line on a map and they said, on this side it's Afghanistan, on that side it's British India. And they drew it right there because the British had figured out that that was as far as they could control with the military. If they tried to get further than that, they were in the mountains. And in the mountains, they didn't have a chance. So that's why that was the line. And then they agreed, the king of Afghanistan agreed that I will accept this line as the border. And in return, what I will give you is I will say the Amu River in the north is the border with Russia, and I will never let any Russian get across the Amu River. So then, the British said, okay, we'll leave you alone. Our deal is you can do whatever you want between those two borders. And over the next 20 years, that king fought something like 20 wars with the different ethnic groups in Afghanistan. And he was a ferocious guy, and he won every battle, and he did terrible things, but he pacified the country, and that's when you can say he unified it. That's what unification usually means is some one guy conquers everybody else. So then at the end of that time, it was a country, and it had borders, and it had a king, and it was divided into provinces, and so on and so on.
Mm. Let's talk a little bit about the Afghan government as you describe in the book, because it was not a, if I remember, yeah, if I remember correctly, it wasn't necessarily a typical government in what you had in mind. So when you think about the how top government, so let's talk a little bit about politics and how the government functioned in Afghanistan.
Well, it was late in history for a government to be functioning this way, but most places were governed this way, let's say 500 years earlier. And it was a tribal feudal country, territory. And that meant that uh, various ethnic tribal groups uh, kind of held power in various parts of the country. And within those areas, there was going to be, some number of tribal lords who were big landowners. And, so they controlled their areas. And then they were, obedient to some bigger tribal lord who was the power in a larger area. And throughout the country, the one thing that everybody shared was everybody was Muslim. So another form of power in Afghanistan was the power of the scholarly class, the religious scholarly class. They were the clerics, and every village had a mullah. Uh, mullah, might have more than one mullah, but a mullah was a religious figure. Um, Islam is a religion in which the religious figure isn't appointed by someone; he just kind of emerges from among the people. But he emerges from among the people because in that little area, whatever it be, he's the guy who can read and write and knows what the Quran says, and he's read some other books, and so he has control of the culture's legal system and and customary ways. Probably in much of Afghanistan, the religious leaders, and they're not actually, most of them, scholars. They haven't read that much. A lot of what they're saying is Islam isn't in the books. It's the tribal customs of the people is kind of conflated with Islam. Um, but they're a power. They were a partner. There was a partnership between the secular power, which is the landowner, and then the religious power, which is the mullah and his people. Uh, and so the country would be a patchwork like that. Now, this fellow Abdurrahman, who was the big king that established the borders, um, he did something that turned out to be, well, I don't know. We're still seeing the result of that. Uh, on the one hand, he didn't challenge the religious establishment. He didn't say, no, religion doesn't rule in my lands. I'm the king. I have an army. I'm the one who rules. He said, religion rules in Afghanistan, and I want to make sure that every person who claims to be a religious leader is really a religious leader. So I'm going to set up a licensing program, and you can't, be a mullah unless you get a certificate from the government that says you've passed a very stiff, difficult exam. So with this exam system, he kind of made himself the overlord of the religious network. Um, and then he also divided the country up into provinces in such a way that the lines of the provinces always cut across the lines of tribal power, so that a person who was a power in a region because he was a tribal, important fellow, uh, he didn't control the province. There was a couple of other tribal lords that were also powerful in that area, and then the king in the capital established a governor over that area, and the governor answered only to the guy in Kabul. So he started to try to break down this local rule and establish a new form of power, which was controlled from the center. Um, and you know, he in order to do this, he also uh, respected no limits in terms of what kinds of punishments and what kinds of uh, you know uh, sheer military power he used to enforce his will. So he became a sort of a legendary, dreaded, almost mythical figure in Afghan history in terms of his cruelty and the savagery of his punishments. Uh, and he established something that uh, I think is probably back in Afghanistan now, which was a Ministry of Vice and Virtue. And the government officials of that ministry were authorized by the central power to go out and arrest people who were, like, say, eating bread in public during the month of fast, or if they were a woman who was out in public without face covering, or any of these other rules that were regarded as the Quranic restrictions, and regarded that way by the most orthodox, most fundamentalist, most religious of the country's religious establishment. So he sort of um, superseded the religious establishment, not by going against them, but by becoming more religious than them, if you see what I'm saying.
Is this kind of the start where we begin to see radical Islam in a way take form in Afghanistan?
It wasn't, well, I don't know if that's the start of it. I think you'd be hard pressed to say what was exactly the start of it. Um, Dost Muhammad, the two kings before this guy, the original, the second founder of Afghanistan, he was the one who first enforced no drinking in Afghanistan. Every place else in the Muslim world, there's a little drinking. In Afghanistan, in my day, absolutely not. You wouldn't see a drop of liquor on the streets anywhere.
Hmm. I want to end this episode before we round up. I want to start in the early 20th century, and of course, with I'm not, I'm again, forgive me if I do say his name wrong, but I'm gonna try to say it right here. Habibullah Khan, who actually succeeded quite peacefully in the throne. So let's talk a little bit about Habibullah Khan's rule before we round up part one.
All right. Well, Habibullah Khan was the son of Abdurrahman Khan. You're right. He took over peacefully, one of the few who came to power in that sort of like just inherited the throne way. And he was able to come to the throne in that way because his father had so thoroughly established the rule of the power in Kabul, the government. And in his father's day, there were some Afghans who had fled the country, and that family had grown up in Turkey at a time when Turkey was going through the Ottoman, Empire was going through the young Turk modernizing, Europeanizing revolution. And people from that family came back to Afghanistan in Habibullah's day. The main figure was a man named Tarzi, and he was very enthusiastic about opening up the country, westernizing it, bringing education in, establishing the authority of science. And Habibullah, this king, started the first, I would say, secular school. It was called Habibia, it was named after him.
Of course.
And, and at that school, as in all of the public schools when I started, a generation later, there was two curriculums. There was the science curriculum, and then there was the traditional curriculum. So you learned, physics, chemistry, math, all of that stuff. And then you also learned literature, theology, religion, how to chant the Quran, and so on. I grew up in that divided system, and every school had both of those things. But they had a scientific, sort of like that was came in, and it was a period, late Habibullah times, when I would say Afghanistan was going through one of those moments of incredible energy and creativity and advancement. And there was a big kind of youth movement in Afghanistan. And in a sense, it came to grief in a way because Habibullah was able to rule very definitively until 1919 when he was assassinated by somebody. And the the rumor was, and I think it's probably true, his own son Amonullah organized his assassination. And Amonullah was a young firebrand. He was eager to even do way much more than his father could. So if you want to I'll just mention that now. I think you're trying to
Yes,
wrap
please.
up. But Amanullah's 10 years in power were a time of absolute, you know, top down attempted modernizing, radical modernizing of Afghanistan. And Amanullah tried to ban the face covering and the veil for women. He tried to ban bride price as a custom of weddings. He tried to, he tried to ban beards. He tried to make it a crime, a punishable by imprisonment crime to wear what the Afghans traditionally wore, turbans and baggy pants and long shirt. It was the law that if you were in Kabul or the vicinity, you had to wear a suit. You had to wear Western clothing.
Did
So
it try to westernize Afghanistan in a way?
yeah, he tried. Uh, and he went to Europe. He was the first king to go to the West from Afghanistan,
Mm.
and he just had a great time. And he traveled around. When he came back, he came back through Iran, and he stopped at every major Afghan city on the way, and gave speeches. And he stopped at in Herat, where there's a famous shrine from a person who's descended. My family is lineally descended from that one. He was a supposed saint and a great poet, Abdullah Ansary. His shrine is like this place where people can go and be monastic retirees from life. Amunullah came and he said, "This place is just superstition. We're going to break this shrine and we're going to sell the land." And
Mm,
then he went to Kandahar, where, Afghans have what they consider to be the shirt or the cloak worn by Prophet Muhammad himself. And on very rare occasions, a new king will bring out this cloak and put it on as an emblem of having authority.
mm,
Amun-Ra came and he gave a speech in which he said, "This old cloak is nothing but used clothing. We're gonna just burn it. We're gonna get rid of
mm.
this." He and every speech he gave reduced his popularity in Afghanistan. And before the end of the decade, he was gone.
Mm. I maybe mixing it up again, but you mentioned the European tour. Was this when he had the controversial holding hand? Was this a guy who was holding hand with his wife, and this was kind of a controversy, or is that later when he?
No, no, this
Yeah.
guy was that controversial guy. His wife was the daughter of that Tarzi I told you about, that came back from Turkey with the had grown up among the Young Turks. When they went to Kabul, they I mean, no, excuse me, when he and his wife went to Europe, they sent back films of them in Europe, and those films were shown to the public at Kabul Cinema. There was a movie theater by then in Kabul, and they showed them his wife wearing Western dresses, sort of bare shoulders, not just the face, and they showed them drinking. They were drinking juice, perhaps, but the religious clerics were there to say that's wine they're drinking, and they showed them eating some kind of meat. It was probably beef, and the clerics were there in the Kabul theater to say that's pork they're eating. So, uh, everything he did to advertise how popular he was in Europe was being used in Kabul to tell the uh, common people the king is turning into an infidel. And here's the proof.
Mm. How was he received on this in Europe on this trip? Was he highly respected, and how did the common people, view that Afghan king coming to visit their country in Europe?
I think my feeling is that he experienced it as we were celebrated and lauded everywhere we went. I think they were seen as a curiosity, so people were enthusiastic about wanting to see them, but it was because it was the king of Afghanistan. It was like this exotic guy from who's ever heard of that place. It was sort of like uh, it was sort of like entertainment or something. I think he was wrong about how popular he thought he was in Europe.
Mm.
And um, he came back through Russia, and he met Lenin, and Lenin also said, "You're one of the revolutionaries, my boy. You and me, we're gonna fix Afghanistan." And he came back and he thought that he had gotten promises of all kinds of development aid from all the countries he'd been in. But within the first couple of years, that aid didn't come. The promises were not as ironclad as he thought them to be.
I mean, to
So,
be fair, Lenin was kind of busy with a civil war at the time, so he was quite occupied.
yes, he was. I don't know how those guys do it. It's like, man, I just can't. I'm overloaded just getting my groceries. And these,
So I think we're gonna round it up there, and of course, next time it's gonna be a real wild episode because we're gonna talk about there's quite a lot that happened in the 20th and 21st centuries. So we're gonna leave it up for now, and of course, I'm looking forward to recording the next part very much. But before we go, where can people find your book, the Games Without Rules, the often interrupted history of Afghanistan? We only touched on the tip of the iceberg, so if you cannot wait for the next episode, you of course should begin to read this book while you are waiting. So where can people find it? And if people have questions for you, where can they find you? If you have social media or you make websites where people might ask further questions about the history of Afghanistan?
Well, they could write to my website at Tamim at mirtamimansari.com. Probably my website is listed on the back of the book, so they could buy the book and then, and then find my website that way. They can Google me, I'm on they can find me that way.
Thank you again so much, Chrome, and very, very much looking forward to record part two. This has been Without H12. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Apple Podcasts, consider to rate us 5 stars. If you're on Apple Podcasts, consider writing a review. If you are on YouTube, please like, share, and subscribe. My name is Anand. This has been Without H12. This is part one. Part two will be available next week. Man, out to you next time.